Jimmy Hoffa, the iconic Teamsters Union chief, disappearing in 1975 without a trace, authorities now indicating they're breaking new ground in the search under a New Jersey bridge.
The search for Jimmy Hoffa has cost millions of dollars, dug up entire farms, and scanned under NFL end zones. All of it for nothing. But here's the kicker. The real story isn't buried in a field. It's buried in a secret confession. Michael Franzese, a former Mafia captain, was told the entire truth by a man who was close to the action. He knows who gave the order, he knows how it happened, and he knows who pulled the trigger. And that man isn't a ghost. He's alive, and Franzese says he has the tapes to prove it. The Hoffa secret comes out. When a man like Michael Franzese speaks, you listen. This isn't just some talking head on a true crime documentary. This is a man who was once one of the most powerful and richest capos in the Colombo crime family, one of New York's infamous 5 families. They called him the Yuppie Don. He was pulling in $8 to $10 million a week for the mob. He wasn't just in the life, he was at the very top of it. He was also the son of the legendary underboss, Sonny Franzese, a man so feared and respected that he was a fixture in the underworld for decades. So when Michael Franzese, who famously walked away from the mob, found God and lived to tell the tale, says he knows who took out Jimmy Hoffa, it's not a theory. It's a statement. For 50 years, the Hoffa case has been a circus of wild speculation, but Franzese cuts through all of it with a story that is chillingly simple and direct. He claims that a high-level mob insider, someone who was there, someone connected to the operation, reached out to him. This man was near the end of his life. He wasn't looking for fame and he wasn't looking for money. He was, as Franzese tells it, looking to clear his conscience. He needed to get this 50-year-old secret off his chest before he met his maker, and he chose Michael Franzese as his confessor. What this dying man told Franzese changes everything. First, he confirmed what many in the upper echelons of the mob always knew. The order to eliminate Hoffa didn't come from Detroit. To put it mildly, the Detroit family was involved in the setup, but they didn't have the authority to sanction a hit on a figure as massive as Jimmy Hoffa. The order came from the very top. It came from the Commission, the board of directors for the National Mafia, based in New York. Hoffa wasn't just a local problem, he had become a national problem, and the Commission decided to solve it. Second, the insider told Franzese exactly what happened to the body. This is the detail that has driven investigators crazy for 5 decades. Forget Giant Stadium. Forget the incinerator in Hamtramck. Forget the car crusher. The insider's account was much cleaner and far more terrifying. He told Franzese the final resting place for Jimmy Hoffa is wet and deep. This points to one of 2 places, the dark, cold depths of the Great Lakes or somewhere off the Atlantic coast. The body was likely placed in a 55-gallon drum, possibly filled with concrete, and dropped from a boat into water so deep that no recovery effort would ever stand a chance. It's the perfect disposal. No evidence, no forensics, no grave to dig up, just gone. But here is the single most explosive part of the confession, the detail that makes this story so urgent right now. The dying insider gave Michael Franzese the name of the man who pulled the trigger. And here's the bombshell. Franzese claims that man is still alive. This is a wow factor that short-circuits the entire public understanding of the case. Nearly every other major suspect in the Hoffa disappearance is long gone. Frank, the Irishman Sheeran, perished in 2003. Salvatore Sally Bugs Briguglio, he was dispatched in 1978. Thomas Andretta, perished. The entire generation of mobsters who would have been involved are by now ghosts. But Franzese is adamant. The man who did the work, the actual trigger man, is, as of his recent interviews, alive and sitting in the federal prison system on other charges. And to back it all up, Franzese claims he has tapes. He recorded his conversations with this insider. He has the man's confession on audio, a secret that could, in theory, blow the lid off America's greatest cold case. This isn't a guess. It's a first-hand account from a man who had nothing left to lose by telling the truth. But to understand why this confession matters, you have to understand the man who disappeared. Hoffa's final mistake. To understand why Jimmy Hoffa had to vanish, you have to understand that he was, in his prime, more powerful than most politicians. Many people are crazy about the mob story, but the real story is about power. James R. Hoffa was a force of nature. He was a brilliant organizer who took the International Brotherhood of Teamsters and built it into the single largest union in the United States. At its peak, the Teamsters had over 2.3 million members. These weren't just truckers, they were the lifeblood of the American economy. If Hoffa decided to call a strike, the country stopped. Trucks stopped, goods stopped, and the economy bled. That's real power. But in the 1950s and 60s, that kind of power came with a price. Hoffa needed muscle to fight the big corporations and break up picket lines. And the Mafia needed something Hoffa had: money. Specifically, they needed access to the Teamsters' crown jewel, the Central States Pension Fund. What many overlooked is that this fund was, for all intents and purposes, the mob's personal bank. You see, the mob couldn't just walk into a Chase bank and ask for a $50 million loan to build a casino. They had no collateral, no credit, but they could go to their friend, Jimmy Hoffa, who controlled the fund. And Hoffa, in turn, would loan them millions. We're talking about a fund worth over $1.6 billion in 1970s money. That's how Las Vegas was built. Iconic casinos like the Stardust, the Desert Inn, and the Fremont were built on Teamster pensions, all thanks to Jimmy Hoffa. It was a perfect relationship. Hoffa got protection and power, and the mob got a piggy bank with no questions asked. The problem started when Hoffa's other great rival, Robert F. Kennedy, made it his personal mission to put him behind bars. After a long, brutal fight, RFK won. In 1967, Hoffa was sent to prison for jury tampering, conspiracy, and fraud. He was supposed to be gone for 13 years. While Hoffa was inside, he handed the reins of the Teamsters to a man named Frank Fitzsimmons. Fitz was, to put it mildly, much more agreeable than Hoffa. He didn't have Hoffa's ego. He didn't fight back. When the mob asked for a loan, Fitz didn't just give it to them. He let them raid the fund with almost no oversight. The mob loved Frank Fitzsimmons. He was their golden goose. Then the unthinkable happened. In 1971, President Richard Nixon commuted Hoffa's sentence. Hoffa was a free man. But here's the kicker. The commutation came with a strict condition. Hoffa was forbidden from engaging in any union activities until 1980. Jimmy Hoffa ignored it. The moment he was out, he started planning his comeback. He was going to take his union back from Fitzsimmons. The mob, of course, was horrified. They had the perfect setup, and Hoffa was threatening to ruin it. They sent warnings. They told him to back off, enjoy his retirement, and stay quiet. Hoffa refused. He was an egomaniac. He believed the union was his. Finally, he made his last fatal mistake. He started making threats. He told associates that if the mob didn't back his return, he would go to the mattresses. He would call the press. He would tell the federal government everything. He would expose every single mobster, every secret loan, and every ounce of control they had over his pension fund. He signed his own death warrant. The commission in New York gave the order. This wasn't a discussion, it was pest control. They just had to lure him to the right spot. That spot was the Machis Red Fox restaurant in Bloomfield Township, Michigan on July 30th, 1975. Hoffa was told he was finally getting the big meeting to clear the air. He was supposed to meet two men, Anthony Tony Jack Giacalone, the ruthless street boss of the Detroit mob, and Anthony Tony Provenzano, a terrifying Genovese family capo from New Jersey. Hoffa had to go. This meeting was his only path back to power. He arrived at 2 p.m. He waited and waited. Tony Jack and Tony Pro were intentionally somewhere else, establishing their alibis. At 2:30 p.m., Hoffa, frustrated, called his wife from a payphone. "He's been stood up," he told her. He was last seen in the parking lot, pacing angrily. Then he was gone. His car was found the next day, unlocked. There was no sign of a struggle, Jimmy Hoffa, one of the most powerful men in America, had simply vanished. Hoffa was gone, and for 50 years the theories have been wilder than fiction. The Irishman and other lies. The moment Jimmy Hoffa disappeared, the mystery machine went into overdrive. You see, when there's a vacuum of information, theories rush in to fill the void. And in this case, the theories became modern American folklore. The thing nobody tells you is that many of these myths were likely started by the mob itself to send the FBI and the press on a 50-year wild goose chase. Let's start with the biggest, most famous lie, Frank the Irishman Sheeran. This story became a global sensation thanks to the Martin Scorsese film, The Irishman. The claim, from Sheeran's own deathbed confession, was that he was the one who pulled the trigger. He claimed he was Hoffa's friend, that he picked him up, drove him to a house in Detroit, and shot him in the back of the head as a favor to his boss, Russell Bufalino. It's a dramatic, personal, and tragic story of betrayal. But here's the thing. Almost no one who seriously investigated the Hoffa case believes it. The FBI tested the bloodstains found in the house where Sheeran claimed the event happened. The result? It was not Jimmy Hoffa's DNA. Not even close. Top journalists like Dan Moldia, who dedicated his entire life to the Hoffa case, have systematically debunked Sheeran's story as a complete fabrication. Sheeran was a union official and a tough guy, but he was not the commission's chosen triggerman for their biggest hit. He was likely a man at the end of his life trying to write himself into history. Then there's the most cinematic myth, Giant Stadium. This is the one everyone knows. The story goes that Hoffa's body was driven from Detroit to New Jersey, stuffed in a drum, and buried in the wet concrete of the brand new stadium being built in the Meadowlands. It was a perfect taunting symbol. Hoffa buried forever under a football field. It was such a powerful story that in 2010, when the stadium was demolished, the FBI was right there. They scanned the ground. They searched the old end zone. And what did they find? Absolutely nothing. No drum, no bones, no Hoffa. It was a ghost story. What about the other theories? Many serious investigators, including veteran reporter Vince Wade, believed the most logical answer was a Detroit incinerator. The theory was that Hoffa was taken from the Red Fox, dispatched and driven to the Central Sanitation Facility in Hamtramck, a place conveniently controlled by the Detroit mob. His body was put into an industrial incinerator and burned to ash. This theory is clean, efficient, and leaves zero evidence. It was, for many years, the most plausible scenario. And you can't forget the ghouls. Notorious figures like Richard the Iceman Kuklinski, a contract operative with dozens of supposed hits, also claimed he did it. Kuklinski claimed he was part of the team, that he froze the body to confuse the time of the event, and then put him in a car crusher. But again, like Sheeran, Kuklinski was a known braggart. He loved the spotlight and had nothing to lose by claiming credit for America's most famous disappearance. This is precisely why Michael Franzese's confession is so radically different. He's not a washed-up hitman trying to get a book deal. He was a capo. His claim of wet and deep instantly debunks the stadium myth and directly contradicts the incinerator theory. His claim that the shooter is still alive debunks the Irishman and every other theory pointing to a man who is already gone. Franzese's story cuts through the lies. It's not cinematic, it's not a dramatic betrayal by a best friend. It was a cold, calculated corporate decision. So if it wasn't Sheeran, who does Franzese believe pulled the trigger? The wet and deep grave. This is the core of the confession, the secret the dying insider gave to Michael Franzese. This is the story that makes the most sense, and it's the one the FBI has circled for decades but could never prove. According to Franzese, the insider confirmed that the hit was not a Detroit operation. The Detroit family, led by Tony Jack Giacalone, was responsible for the lure. Their job was to get Hoffa to the Machus Red Fox to make him feel safe on his home turf. But the actual work, the wet work, was handled by specialists. The order came from the commission, and it was given to the Genovese crime family, the crew run by Hoffa's other rival, Tony Provenzano. The insider gave Franzese a name, The man who pulled the trigger was Stevie Andretta. Now, if you're asking who, that's the point. Stevie Andretta was not a household name. He wasn't a boss. He wasn't a movie character. He was a soldier, a quiet, effective, loyal soldier in the Genovese family. And that is who you send to do a job like this. You don't send a boss. You don't send a famous hitman. You send a man who can get the job done, keep his mouth shut, and disappear. Stevie Andretta and his brother, Thomas Andretta, had been on the FBI's radar for years as prime suspects. They were known enforcers for Tony Pro. But here is the detail from Franzese that changes the entire case. At the time of his interviews, Michael Franzese stated that this man, Stephen Andretta, was still alive. He was an old man, but he was alive, and he was serving time in the federal prison system for unrelated crimes. This claim is the bombshell. The man who ended Jimmy Hoffa's life was not a ghost. He was a number in the Bureau of Prisons. This revelation, if true, is staggering. It means the one person on Earth who knows exactly what happened on July 30th, 1975, where Hoffa was taken, who was in the room, and where the body went, was alive and reachable. So, let's paint the picture based on this confession. Hoffa is fuming in the parking lot. A car pulls up. It's not Tony Pro or Tony Jack. It's a lower-level guy, someone Hoffa might have recognized, or perhaps even his foster son, Chucky O'Brien, who has always been suspected of driving the car. Hoffa is told the meeting moved to a nearby house for security. He gets in. They drive a few miles to a home, possibly one owned by a Detroit mob associate. Hoffa walks in expecting to see the bosses. Instead, he sees the New Jersey crew. He sees Stevie Andretta. Before he can even react, it's over. A quick, professional, silent operation. From there, the wet and deep part of the plan kicks in. The body is put into a 55-gallon steel drum. It's loaded onto a truck, possibly a refrigeration truck, to mask any smell. It's not buried. It's not burned. It's driven, maybe hundreds of miles. It could have gone to a quiet dock on Lake Erie or Lake Huron, or it could have been driven all the way back east to a mob-controlled port in New Jersey. The drum is weighted down, rolled off the side of a boat, and sinks thousands of feet to the bottom of the water. It's the perfect crime. No body, no DNA, no crime scene, and the trigger man, Stevie Andretta, keeps his mouth shut for 50 years. Eventually going to prison for something else entirely, taking the nation's biggest secret with him. This is the story from The Insider. But does it mean the case is finally solved? A 50-year-old mystery. So that's the story. Michael Franzese, a man with impeccable mob credentials, gets a deathbed confession from an insider. The story names the shooter as Stevie Andretta, claims he's still alive in prison, and says the body is wet and deep. Many people are crazy about this theory because, frankly, it just makes sense. It ties up all the loose ends. It explains why no body has ever been found. It comes from a source who had everything to lose and nothing to gain by lying. But before we fully dive into why the Franzese theory feels so right, we have to understand the absolute circus of misinformation that has surrounded this case for half a century. To appreciate the simple, brutal logic of the Andretta story, you have to see the house of mirrors it replaced. For decades, the disappearance of Jimmy Hoffa wasn't just a mystery, it was a national obsession, a modern myth. And that myth created monsters. For a long time, the most popular theory was the one told by Frank the Irishman Sheeran. This story, made world famous by a best-selling book and a 9-figure Hollywood blockbuster, is pure cinema. Sheeran claimed he was the one. He said he was a longtime friend of Hoffa, which made the betrayal all the more chilling. The story goes that he flew with Hoffa on a small plane, drove him to an empty house in Detroit, and upon entering put 2 bullets into the back of his old friend's head. He claimed it was a direct order and he was just a soldier following it. It's a fantastic story. It's dramatic. It's personal. It's exactly what Hollywood loves. The movie even showed the cleanup crew coming in, tearing out the floorboards and disposing of the body at a local crematorium. But here's the problem. Almost no one in the know believes it. FBI agents who worked the case have gone on record saying Sheeran's story doesn't add up. The blood evidence found in the house decades later was tested, and the DNA did not match Jimmy Hoffa. Furthermore, Sheeran had a reputation for, let's call it, storytelling. He was a known fabricator. Many believe he was flat broke and created the story to sell a book and leave some money for his family. It was his last great con. It's a great movie, but as a theory, it's riddled with holes. If the Irishman theory was cinematic, the next one was purely mythical. The Giant Stadium. This is the one everyone thinks they know. The legend says Hoffa was disposed of at the construction site of the old Giant Stadium in the Meadowlands of New Jersey. He was, as the story goes, buried in the concrete foundation, forever a part of Section 107. This theory had legs for a simple reason. It made poetic sense. The mob controlled the unions that built the stadium. What better, more darkly funny place to hide a body than in plain sight, buried under the feet of tens of thousands of people? It was the ultimate inside joke. This rumor became so powerful that in 2004, the FBI actually listened. They got a tip from a mob informant and spent a small fortune drilling into the concrete of the old stadium. They even brought in Sniffer, a legendary cadaver dog. And what did they find? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. When the stadium was finally demolished in 2010, crews were on high alert. They watched every scoop of concrete. Again, nothing. Even the popular TV show Mythbusters tested the theory. They proved that burying a body in wet concrete wouldn't work the way people think. The decomposition gases would bubble and crack the concrete, leaving a nasty, obvious mess. The Giant Stadium was, and always has been, a myth. This is where the theories get truly wild. One of the most gruesome and frankly efficient theories is that Hoffa was never buried at all. When a man vanishes, the first question is always who. But with Jimmy Hoffa, that was the easy part. The who was almost certainly the mob. The real mystery, the one that has haunted investigators and obsessed the public for half a century, is where? Where do you hide the body of one of the most famous and infamous men in America? For decades, the answers have been the stuff of legends. He's under the end zone at Giant Stadium. He's buried in a swamp in Florida. He's at the bottom of a river, encased in concrete. These theories are dramatic, cinematic, and almost certainly wrong. The truth, according to many experts, is likely far stranger and more chilling. The mob didn't just want to eliminate Jimmy Hoffa, they wanted to erase him. They wanted to make him disappear so completely that there would be no grave, no shrine, and no evidence, ever. To do that, they needed a plan that was as brutal as it was brilliant. This brings us to one of the most horrifying theories, one that sounds like it's ripped straight from a gangster movie, but has a terrifying logic to it. The story goes that he was lured into a car not by strangers, but by men he knew, men he trusted. He was taken to a mob-controlled junkyard, a place where cars went to die, and then he was processed. The theory states that Hoffa, still inside the car, was placed into an industrial car compactor. He and the vehicle were crushed together, compressed into a single, unrecognizable 10,000-pound metal cube. It's a horrifying thought, but it is, in many ways, the perfect crime. That cube, which was once a car and a man, was then allegedly put onto a freighter. It was shipped to Japan as simple scrap metal, mixed in with thousands of other identical cubes. Within weeks, it would have been dropped into a blast furnace, melted down at 3,000 degrees, and turned into something new. A girder for a skyscraper, a new car, a washing machine. There would be no body, no evidence, no DNA, no grave to dig up. The evidence was, quite literally, recycled. The man who had moved millions of dollars was reduced to the value of scrap steel. This theory explains why he was never found. You can't find something that has been unmade, returned to its base elements. It's an ending so final, it's almost poetic in its brutality. And yet, for some, even this incredible theory isn't dark enough. It explains the how, but it might be missing the real why. This brings us to the darkest theory of all. What if the mob didn't do it, or at least not on their own? Think about it. Jimmy Hoffa wasn't just a union boss, he was one of the most powerful men in America. As head of the Teamsters, he controlled the arteries of the entire nation. If his truck stopped, the country stopped. But more than that, he had dirt on everyone. He knew about mob connections that went to the very highest levels of government. He had deep, dark, and dangerous information about the Kennedy family. Remember, it was Robert F. Kennedy who, as Attorney General, made it his personal crusade to put Hoffa behind bars. It was a war, and in a war, both sides collect ammunition. Hoffa knew where the bodies were buried, metaphorically and perhaps literally. He knew how the Teamsters' massive pension fund, the mob's personal bank, had been used to finance casinos, to buy politicians, and to fund clandestine operations. In 1975, Hoffa was a man on a mission. He was out of prison and desperate to reclaim his power as head of the Teamsters. The mob, who had grown comfortable with his more pliable replacement, told him no. So some researchers believe Hoffa was getting ready to talk. He was preparing to use his ultimate trump card. He was threatening to expose a web of corruption that linked organized crime directly to Washington, D.C. and to the political elite. In this version of the story, his disappearance wasn't a mob hit. It was a state-sponsored execution. It was a cleanup operation carried out by rogue agents to silence a man who knew too much. A man who was about to set fire to the entire system. In this theory, his body isn't in a stadium or a swamp. It wasn't crushed in a junkyard. It was disposed of with cold military precision, flown on an unmarked plane, incinerated at a secure facility, or dropped into the deep ocean from a government vessel. It would be an operation so clean it would leave no trace. The mob, who also wanted him gone, would be the perfect scapegoat. They would take the blame, and the real secret, the rot at the heart of the government, would be safe. This is why the case remains so potent. It's not just a missing person file, it's a conspiracy that could touch the very top of the power structure. But what if both of these theories, the cinematic junkyard and the deep state plot, are wrong? What if we've all been overthinking it, looking for a Hollywood ending to a story that was anything but? This is why the Michael Franzese story hits so hard. Franzese is not a theorist. He's not a journalist. He's a former capo regime of the Colombo crime family, a real-life high-ranking made man. When he talks about how the mob operates, it's not speculation, it's testimony. And his story, after decades of Hollywood fantasies, concrete stadiums, and wild government plots, is simple, direct, and frankly, boring, which is exactly why it's so believable. Franzese, in interviews, has laid out the most likely scenario, one he reportedly heard from an inside source. There was no grand, complicated plan. There was no industrial car compactor. There was no deep state plot. The mob doesn't do complicated. Complicated leaves witnesses. Complicated leaves evidence. The mob does efficient. According to this version, there was just a meeting, a car, a loyal soldier, allegedly Stevie Andretta, who was like a son to the very men Hoffa was supposed to meet. Hoffa gets in the car. The hit happens right then and there. Simple, fast, no witnesses. And the body. It was disposed of in a place described simply as wet and deep. It could be a swamp in New Jersey, it could be a lake, it could be a stretch of the Atlantic Ocean. The point is, it wasn't a statement. It wasn't a public execution. It was just garbage disposal. So, do you believe Franzese's story, or is the truth still buried? Let us know in the comments. Hit subscribe and like the video.